Hello and welcome to this video on making jerky. Jerky, jerk meat, dried meat and so on are all the names for the same basic process, that is preserving meat through removing water. Making jerky is much easier than making something like salami and a similar sausage type preserved meat. That is because it is less processed and therefore less vulnerable to bacterial contamination. Historically, jerky was much more dehydrated than what is commercially available today. Think boot leather and rubber tires, not a slightly chewy and flavorful strip of meat. The need for this was, well, simple. Over long journeys, winter and early periods of settlement in a new location, meat was hard if not impossible to come by, and definitely not a reliable resource. This meant if you slaughtered a cow, ox, deer and so on, the unused meat would rot unless preserved. Drying the meat achieved this with little effort, or resources by comparison to salting, jugging and similar processes. This meant that meat could be hung in a clean, dry and warm place to dry with no more equipment or effort required for a basic preserved jerky than what was already in use. Modern jerky is a little different. Well, in some ways a lot different. Where historical jerky was made to preserve the meat, modern jerky is in some ways meant to just preserve meat for camping or similar, but it's largely a flavor and texture. This means that we don't have to worry as much about the long-term storage capacity or ability of the jerky. Rather, it is expected to be consumed within a very short time frame. With this in mind, we'll look at how to preserve two different meats, chicken and beef. The two different meats need somewhat different handling. This is because they respond to both the preliminary steps and dehydrating steps somewhat differently. First, we have beef or cow meat. This is arguably the easier of the two options. Starting with a piece of beef. A low-fat cut is better, so look at something like eye fillet, rump, topside, flank, or a similar low-fat cut. For this we're using an eye fillet or girello. This has already been trimmed to make it more square and uniform. We've placed it in the freezer for 30 minutes before preparation, and this makes it hard enough to cut easily without mushing the beef while also allowing for more convenient and uniform cuts. First, we cut the beef into conveniently long strips. These are what each serve of jerky strip will be. As we slice the beef, each slice is about 1 centimeter or about 1/3 of an inch in thickness. Err on the side of thinner than thicker. And now we have the meat cut to size, it's time for flavor. This will be in the form of a marinade. We use a marinade, but you will find a lot of commercial jerky brands have a sort of almost syrup type marinade that coats the jerky. It keeps the meat soft and juicy, but it's also kind of tacky. We're going to be using a combination of Worcestershire sauce, salt, pepper, and red wine. You could add things like garlic, onion powder, use instead of teriyaki sauce, add bourbon, a sweet or sour plum sauce, and so on. There are a lot of different recipes out there, but what we're going for is a simple, reliable, and flavorful recipe. We've combined all the marinated ingredients and placed our beef strips into it, stirring it thoroughly so that all the pieces are covered completely in the marinade. We need to let it sit for 2 hours, if not up to 24 hours. Arguably, the longer the better. After 24 hours, the flavor should have permeated into the beef strips completely. Take them out and we place them onto a wire stand. It's something similar to that used for baking. This will allow any remaining marinade to drain away. This also makes it a little bit easier for the next step. We leave it like this on top of the wire stand for about 15 minutes in the fridge. While the marinade drains, we prepare the food dehydrator. You can also use an oven with the door open or something similar in order to do this. If you really want to be rustic, you can do this outside while the air temperature is cold but the wind is blowing. It's, in a manner of speaking, similar to vacuum dehydrating, but it's difficult to do. For the sake of reliability, food safety and ease of application, we will use a food dehydrator. Place your marinated beef strips across the 2 racks closest to your dehydrator's blower. If you stack any more than this, you will need to rotate the racks to get a consistent finish for all the jerky you make. If you don't, you'll find that some of it is extremely dry, and some of it isn't really dry at all depending on how high you stack it. You will need to dehydrate the jerky for a minimum of 4 hours. It may take you significantly longer if there is a lot of marinade present, if it is a particularly juicy cut, and if the area in which you're dehydrating it is already quite rich in moisture. That's because the dehydrator can't draw out as much of the moisture in the meat because of it. You'll know that beef jerky is done when it's dry to the touch, but still slightly soft and almost squishy. This should leave the jerky still chewy and tasty without being boot leather tough. You can dehydrate it for longer to get a drier, tougher and more long-term stable jerky, a particularly useful thing if you want to use it for camping. And now for the chicken jerky. The reason we separate chicken jerky is both due to some of the marinade steps that are different, and more importantly, it is the dehydrating process. The chicken jerky is more likely to result in salmonella poisoning if you get the drying part of making chicken jerky wrong. This is, in a manner of speaking, similar to the issues with making something like salami. If you get it wrong, the bacteria can grow very quickly and you won't know about it until you spend a lot of time in the toilet or behind a shrub trying to, get over the food poisoning. In terms of preparing your chicken, you're going to follow the same broad processes as for beef jerky. The only difference is that there are fewer cuts of meat that are suitable. A focus on breast and arguably thigh meat. A breast will give you longer jerky strips and is a bit leaner. Thigh meat is arguably better flavoured if you're going to make a very simple and less flavoured jerky. For example, if you use breast meat, you can basically use any marinade you want. If you're going to go with thigh meat, you might be using this for camping and therefore a relatively unflavoured chicken jerky is useful, as you can add it to just about anything, rehydrate it, and now you have tasty chicken to add to it. Cut your chicken strips into 1 cm thick strips after placing the chicken meat into the freezer for 30 minutes. And in some cases up to 1 hour before cutting. It will depend significantly on the size of the meat you're cutting. Doing so will make it easier to cut long thin strips without having to get awkward in your handling of the meat. While the meat partially freezes, start preparing your marinade. Like with beef, there are many options. Try with something somewhat acidic. This acidic base, such as malt vinegar, apple cider vinegar, Worcestershire sauce or an alcohol, will help to keep some of the moisture inside of the chicken. In terms of jerky moisture, not actually keeping it moist. You then add your herbs, spices and sauces to this as per your taste. Add your chicken strips to the marinade and mix thoroughly so it is covered. Keep the marinade chicken in the fridge for 2 hours as a minimum and up to 24 hours. Now place your chicken strips in the dehydrator, but give them more room than you would for beef, as you'll need air and heat to circulate more around the chicken. Largely because it's somewhat more difficult to dry, and if it doesn't dry properly, food poisoning is what you'll get, not jerky. Unlike beef, where you can get away with less than 4 hours if the meat is thinly cut and lean, with little marinade left, you need to give chicken a minimum of 4 hours, and probably closer to 8. Make sure you rotate the trays around, and you may need to flip the chicken strips over partway through to get a consistent and completely dry chicken jerky strip. The jerky will be done once it looks dry and begins to split like a tree branch when bent. If the jerky remains pliable and doesn't begin to split, it's probably completely dry, but will not store as well. Think of it as almost like the way wood splinters when you bend something. That's almost the appearance you want if you want it to store well for longer term. If you're going to eat it very soon, not having that is an indicator that's about done, but you want to be a bit cautious. Either way, it will not store anywhere near as long as beef jerky, and that's an important caveat to indicate here. Chicken generally will not last as long as beef jerky, although they are both preserved the same way. With chicken, after you finish the dehydrator process, it is a good idea to set it aside to cool to room temperature. As this happens, turn on your oven to a high temperature for jerky, somewhere around 130 to 140 degrees Celsius. This should be somewhere around 270 freedom units. Once the jerky is cooled, place it in the hot oven to be dried and kill off any bacteria a second time. This is almost similar in a manner of speaking to pasteurization. This should keep the jerky safe to eat for a bit longer, and one way to extend the storage time for chicken jerky in particular, although this can be used for beef jerky. Which brings us to some final tips, hints and tricks. First, using an alcohol can help in adding flavour and preserving your jerky. However, not all alcohols suit all jerky. For example, red wine won't suit chicken, but a bourbon would. The other advantage to using an alcohol is that it does have some antiseptic properties. However, a sugar-rich alcohol, for example beer, would not help at all in that respect and may not even really add any preservative qualities. The acidic effect of alcohol, however, will help somewhat in sealing the meat. Then we also have the fact that, use of alcohol will help to dry your jerky. Apart from the fact that it seals the meat, it will displace water in that outer layer of the jerky. This means it will evaporate off more easily. It means you can, to a certain extent, decrease the dehydration time. Then we have the fact that you can add oil to your marinade. Now, this can be very helpful, but you do not want to add very much. The reason this is useful is that it will keep your jerky moist for longer, or at least it will feel and taste moist. Part of this is because the oil will replace the lost water, and it will be more effective if you use alcohol, as what you'll find is the water gets displaced by the alcohol, and then the alcohol allows for the oil to penetrate into the jerky. But oils generally aren't as, let's say, supportive of bacteria, so you shouldn't get contamination as easily this way, or the opportunity for bacteria to grow. We then have the fact you can use salt, but it should be used sparingly. If you use too much salt, the jerky will be, too salty and taste terrible. It will also, rather obviously, not just make it taste like salt, but it will make it very, very difficult to eat. It'll be very tough. A little bit of salt will help to draw away water and dry your meat. Too much will ruin it. In some respects, this is one issue you might find with dry rubs, as these tend to be easier to use, particularly if you want to avoid the use of extra fluids, or to ensure that your meat is as dry as possible when you're making into jerky using more rustic methods. But these dry rubs tend to have a reasonable amount of salt in them, but that can be a consideration. Smoking jerky after it's dry can also be useful. Just be aware that, it will dry it more, so you may want to stop drying earlier in the dehydrator, and then smoke the jerky meat to add the smoky flavor. This is also useful as a way to further extend the storage of the jerky. And finally, we do have storage. The jerky is safe at room temperature for up to 3 weeks with no issue for the most part. If you put it in a fridge, it may be up to 6 weeks. This will, however, vary considerably. Your choice of recipe, meat, local conditions, and all manner of other factors could shorten or extend these safe windows of time. It is only a very broad guideline. Hopefully this shows the most basic way to preserve meat for winter in historical terms, and a different flavor and product in modern terms. Something different if you particularly want a snack and you want something protein rich. A jerky works well. It's tasty, it's convenient, and, depending on how you want to look at this, you can make it as rich or bland as you see fit. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.